Well, this is our lectionary Bible study, and today we're looking at Proper 12, Year A. Let's begin with the collect. O God, the protector of all that trust in thee, without whom nothing is strong, nothing is holy, increase and multiply upon us thy mercy, that thou, being our ruler and guide, we may so pass through things temporal, that we finally lose not the things eternal. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. The thing that intrigues me about this collect is that little reference at the beginning, without whom nothing is strong. So holy, of course, that makes sense right away. But I think sometimes we kind of overlook and forget about the strength of God. Of course, it's inherent in the definition of God, all-powerful. But at the same time, I think when we reflect on things spiritual, our mind tends to go first to things more kind of docile and peaceful and, a quiet dawn and a beautiful sunset and a peaceful lake and, this kind of serene pastoral images, and not so much to like Samson grabbing a jawbone and killing 300 people or something like that, this kind of overwhelming displays of power. But of course we get that throughout the Bible, and like crossing through the Red Sea and all these very dramatic things. So without God, we are not strong and can't be strong. He's the source of all strength. And I remember the way I explained it in my religion classes in day school is, we have these omni words about God. God is all-powerful, omnipotent, omnipresent, so on. So it's like God has all power, we have some power. So you notice in Genesis he gave man dominion. So it doesn't mean man is all-powerful, but he gets a share in power. Just like God is omnipresent, he's present everywhere. But in Genesis, they get a garden, they get a home, they get a place. So they have a place. They are present in one place, but God is present everywhere, and so on. Well, let's look at the first lesson from 1 Kings, chapter 3, verses 5 through 12. And, of course, this is the first in 6 historical books that come along in the Old Testament. Oh, no, we get 1 and 2 Samuel before that, and then we get to Kings. So 1 Kings 3, 5 through 12. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, Ask what I shall give you. And Solomon said, Thou hast shown great and steadfast love to thy servant David my father, because he walked before thee in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward thee. And thou hast kept for him this great and steadfast love, and hast given to him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, thou hast made thy servant king in place of David my father. Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or to come in. And thy servant is in the midst of thy people, whom thou hast chosen, a great people, that cannot be numbered or counted for multitude. Give thy servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern thy people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this thy great people? It pleased the Lord that Samuel had asked this. And God said to him, Because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches, or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been seen before you, and none shall arise after you. So there's this inaugural blessing upon Solomon as the heir of David. I wonder if my notes say anything about his age here. 1 Kings 3, 5. It says he was about 20. I'm not sure how far in his reign this is, if he has just become king or if it's been a few years. But he's still a youth, and he's more childlike, we might say, in experience than in age, although some people consider 20-year-olds still child or adolescents. Now, I guess technically they are in terms of insurance, but I think that's a different thing. And this is, well, what do we know about Solomon? Well, of course, of reputation, we know him for wisdom, and this is really kind of the origin story about that. Also, we know him as being someone of great riches, and this is kind of the origin story about that as well. So he didn't, as one might have typically expect, ask for power and wealth. He asked for wisdom. And so along with wisdom comes the power and wealth that attends to it. And so Solomon is known for wisdom and for power and for wealth. David unified the nation, really. Saul was the first king, and they were still kind of a confederation of tribes during Saul's time. It wasn't until David that they really began to integrate together as a unified whole. And perhaps as it was with the American Civil War, it's not really until you get to war that you really come together in a certain way that you don't without it. And that happens, I think, in a practical sense of, like think about the American Civil War, about all these young boys who had never been, more than 20 miles from where they were born. All of a sudden they were going all over the country, and they were bonding with people from all over the place. So in just a sociological sense, the nation becomes unified. And also, you're fighting for the preservation of a nation and the building of a nation. And so, since you're so invested, it begins to kind of solidify more and more into one solid thing. Shelby Foote in the Civil War Ken Burns miniseries documentary had that great line about, I forget exactly how it says it, but the Civil War is what made us an is. So he said before the Civil War, grammatically, when we refer to the United States are, because it's a collection of states. So it's plural. United States is plural. After the war, United States is singular. It's a country. The United States is. And so he said the war made us an is. I thought that was very insightful.
That's a very strong.
And it might be the same type of thing with basically the civil war that occurs under David. Because remember, his son Absalom wants to overthrow his father, and there's a civil war that ensues. David wins, of course, and Solomon is the last son to be born, the son of Bathsheba, and we all know that story.
One of the writer members of the parish, Tom Pruitt, didn't like Solomon.
Well, his reputation is about wisdom and about wealth and power, but also there's a dark side to Solomon in the sense that he also represents the kind of the corruption of the nation too, because they're at the height of their prominence under Solomon, but also the nation splits apart right after that. And Solomon gets in trouble in terms of idolatry because he forms alliances with all these powers around them, and the way you do that typically is through intermarriage. And so he accumulates, I forget how many wives, 50, 100, whatever it is. And they're basically all political alliances. So you bring in this princess from wherever, Addis Ababa, and she brings her own priests and her own idols, and she does her own thing, and they even set up some of these idols in the Jerusalem temple. So there's the great corruption that comes in, religiously speaking, with that. And of course, that's kind of a side effect of building this dynasty and this power. Also, along with the nation building and the power building comes great construction projects. And I know Father Rogers likened it as sort of a parallel or a kind of an ironic twist. They left Egypt where they were slaves doing these construction projects for the nation. And lo and behold, now in their own nation, they're kind of like these servile workers or slaves again, doing all these great public works projects. So there was enormously high taxes, basically kind of big government oppression under Solomon. and that probably fed into a desire to for the northern tribes to split apart and be their own. So Solomon is definitely there's good and there's bad, and there's a light side and a dark side to both Solomon himself and the era that he represents. But here, of course, is kind of the origin story of his blessing, and that goes back to his wisdom. And so wisdom will be one of the themes that carries through the lessons for this Sunday.
How long did he reign?
I don't remember, and I don't know if I have it in my notes anywhere.
Was it?
It wasn't a short time,
It was maybe.
but I don't know if he was the longest.
Okay.
And
God telling him that the last sentence, there have been none before you, and none like you shall arise
right.
after you. It's like no one else is going to be that wise.
Well, we can certainly say that no other, not only no other Israelite king, but no other king that I'm aware of has this reputation for wisdom. I mean, he is the wise guy. You ask anybody, people who don't know much of anything about the Bible, then, oh yeah, Solomon's wisdom, the wisdom of Solomon. If you've heard anything, that's one of the things you've heard about. And of course, there's irony built into that inherently. You know, he's renowned for his wisdom, and yet at the same time, he does things that are very foolish. And I think it's a reminder that even someone who is very gifted doesn't mean they're perfect. You know, they have their own faults.
It says here the conventional dates of Solomon's reign are about 970 to 931 BCE, normally given in alignment with the dates of David's reign.
Okay, so 3 or 4 decades, pretty good reign, and it makes sense because he takes over when he's fairly young, and I don't recall him dying of violent death. Well, let's go to the Psalm. We get an excerpt from Psalm 119, the great Torah Psalm. This psalm is built upon an acrostic of the alphabet. And also we should take note that, and I think this is toward the end, maybe the very end. No, it goes up to verse 176. So close to the end. Every verse makes a reference to the Torah in some fashion or another. So you'll get, you go through the whole thesaurus. You get testimonies, statutes, ordinances, word, basically every type of word you can come up with that makes a reference to the law of Moses. So keep that in mind as we look through this excerpt, which is Psalm 119, verses 129 to 136. Thy testimonies are wonderful, therefore doth my soul keep them. When thy word goeth forth, it giveth light and understanding unto the simple. I opened my mouth and drew in my breath, for my delight was in thy commandments. O look thou upon me, and be merciful unto me, as thou usest to do unto those that love thy name. Order my steps in thy word, and so shall no wickedness have dominion over me. O deliver me from the wrongful dealings of men, and so shall I keep thy commandments. Show the light of thy countenance upon thy servant, and teach me thy statutes. Mine eyes gush out with water, because men keep not thy law. So a wonderful ode to the law of Moses, praising the commandments of God. And I think perhaps if there's a kind of a key verse in this, it would be 130. When thy word goeth forth, it giveth light and understanding to the simple. So in other words, wisdom. Well, let's look at Romans. And we noted before that with the original Roman Catholic 3-year lectionary, for whatever reason, we had gotten a week apart from them, and we start to come back into sync. It doesn't overlap perfectly, but it does overlap some. So we are on Romans 8, 26 through 34. And remember, Romans is the great treatise that Paul wrote to the church in Rome before he visited laying out his doctrine. The Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with sighs too deep for words. And he who searches the hearts of men knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. We know that in everything God works for good with those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he knew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. What then shall we say to this? If God is for us, who is against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, will he not also give us all things with him? Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? It is Christ Jesus who died, yes, who was raised from the dead, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed intercedes for us. Okay, well, this is the passage where we get the mention of predestination. So I thought I would turn to my theological dictionary to get an official definition of that. And when we hear about predestination, we tend to immediately think, oh, that's a Presbyterian thing. And that's kind of what they're known for, because Calvin uniquely taught what we call double predestination. That is, everybody gets one or the other. You're predestined to heaven or predestined to hell. But that's not the original Catholic doctrine. In Catholicism, you have a doctrine of predestination. It just doesn't get much attention. And I think partly because, that's been taken over by the Presbyterians. So they can have that one. So predestination, or being foreordained, it says being elected for salvation through the eternal foreknowledge and will of God. The Pelagian controversy provoked from St. Augustine of Hippo some extreme assertions about God electing. And you have to be aware also that the Protestant reformers were particularly students of Augustine. And so they tend to take kind of one side of Augustine and exaggerate that side, that line of Augustine's thinking. And that basically develops into sort of the gist of Protestant reform and teaching. So the Pelagian controversy provoked from St. Augustine some extreme assertions about God electing from the mass of sin, which is the human race, only some for eternal salvation. Disallowing the universal saving will of God, John Calvin held a double predestination. Some human beings are elected by God for eternal salvation and others for eternal damnation. This view has been held by the monk Gottschalk in the 800s and condemned at synods in Mainz and Quersy, I don't know where that is, while properly vindicating the primacy of the divine grace on which we depend utterly. Predestination should not be pushed to the point of denying either God's universal saving will or human freedom. So the Calvinists, the full-blooded Calvinists, and very few actually are, it's sort of like St. Francis's rule. As soon as Calvin laid out his doctrine, everybody wanted to mitigate it and modify it and basically make it kinder and gentler here and there in places. Let's see what it says here.
Is this a Protestant dictionary?
So this one is kind of it's written by two Jesuits, which, but it's meant to be sort of an ecumenical resource. It focuses a lot on the Catholic perspective, but it tries to bring in everything.
Well, you get a good idea of how things were going. You could just relax and enjoy yourself, eat, drink, and be merry, instead of just struggling to be good.
Yeah. And when you get to predestination, too, also it seems like something that is I think it would frustrate Paul himself, because it seems like one of those things that he kind of mentioned on the side, and then somebody took it and just ran with it. And this is not my main point here. My main point is that God works things out for you. He uses things for good. So the key line in this, I think, is verse 28. But we know that in everything God works for good with those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. So God not only is working with you now, but he's been looking out for you before there was even a you. It's back before the beginnings of the world. God had you in mind and what your purpose was, and he had a plan for you and a calling for you and so on. So the Catholic doctrine is that God has predestined all of us for salvation. Sort of like in 1 Timothy, God desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. That doesn't mean that we're all forced to fall into that pattern. Some of us run off the road, some earlier, some later. But God has a plan for us. He's been looking out for us. And since he has a predestination or a plan, he calls us. He reaches out to justify us, make us holy, and bring us to the end result of that process of justification, which is communion with God. That's basically what's touched on when he talks about being glorified.
Well, a function of that kind of sort of is when you really get a feeling that you look back in your life and you see that what God's guidance has been, it just wasn't a series of fortuitous accidents.
Yeah.
Got coincidences or whatever the thing was, and then you begin to see how your life is just all unfolded, unless you screw it up. But it's anyway.
Yeah, definitely 20/20 hindsight. You can see the hand of God very clearly sometimes. And I think that pairs very nicely with when he talks about how all things work out for good, even the things that look very bad, the things that are troublesome and trying and difficult times. And sometimes we can see in hindsight how one situation has prepared us for the next one to come along. Whereas if we hadn't gone through that before, we wouldn't have had kind of the tools in our toolbox that we needed later on. And sometimes it goes beyond ourselves. The things that we have gone through and the tools that we have acquired get applied to someone else in their particular life and situation. So it's not just even within ourselves, but goes beyond ourselves. We'll turn to the gospel, and over these 3 weeks we've been having kingdom parables, all of them about farming in one way or another. We go a little bit beyond that with this, and also I think the Roman Catholic lectionary goes a little further than we do and picks up a little later, so it doesn't line up precisely. I believe they start after the mustard seed, which is where we begin, and they start probably with the leaven in the loaf, but they end with a conclusion which I think is what this is all driving to. And I haven't looked at the week after to see if we pick up with that one or if we skip it. But the way it ends, let's see, this goes to verse 49. So a lot of times after Jesus tells some parables, he kind of checks in with them. Sometimes he has to explain further and say, well, this represents that, and so on. But there's usually this kind of, what we get in verse 51, have you understood all these things? And they say to him, yes. And then he kind of undergirds that, the reason why they need to understand all these things. He said to them, therefore every scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like a head of a household who brings forth out of his treasure things new and old. And it's unfortunate that we don't have that, because I think that's really kind of the interpretive key or what everything is driving to. And I heard a great discussion this week, Hank Hanegraaff talking with a guy who made a documentary about the Bible. I forget the name of the documentary. It's like Fragments of Glory or something like that. And it's about textual criticism and textual evidence and why believe the historicity and the reliability of the scriptures and things. And he talked about how Jesus would tell these parables, and he would repeat them, and he would ask them about them. Do you understand all these things? And he tied it into the fact that they were meant to go out and share these stories, and they needed to understand the message behind them, because the Christian idea of inspiration is not just dictation. That's basically the Muslim idea of the inspiredness of the Quran, is that it was dictated word for word and copied down. That's why it can't be translated. I mean, it can, but not officially. Everybody has to learn Arabic, even if you're, a Chinese Muslim or whatever. But here, he wanted his followers to take these messages beyond the boundaries of culture and language. And so if you're going to go and translate or retell the story, you need to have an understanding of what in the world the story is all about, and how to kind of, because there's a lot of subtleties in translation and even just speaking to a new culture with the same language. You have to adapt and make things fit. And so the one who is a scribe, who is prepared for the kingdom, is one who is able to adapt, not in the sense of changing up the message, but in the sense of fitting it into a new culture and making it understood. So he brings out of his treasure things new and things old. So he brings out old stuff, Jesus' message, and he brings in new things, a way for it to fit into a new culture and be understood. So just like Jesus has made sure that they understand everything, they need to make sure that they convey that understanding and that their hearers catch on and understand as well. With that idea of where we're going, let's go back and look at the parables that we cover. So chapter 13, starting verse 31, going to 33, and then skipping down. And I think the part where we skip has the explanation that we got last time about the wheat and the tares. And we pick up verse 44 through 49. Another parable Jesus put before the crowd, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs, and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour, till it was all leavened. And then we skip that explanation about the wheat and the tares and pick up verse 44. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up, and then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net, which was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into vessels, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the close of the age. So we get a whole smorgasbord of parables here. And some of them overlap, and some of them you're going to have to stretch a little bit to get them to overlap. But we'll just kind of comment a little bit one by one. And so all of these touch on the kingdom. They can and do overlap with the church, but also we should think in terms of eschatology, that God is remaking the whole world. And so this is not just about the church, but about the future of all creation. So the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed. It's referred to as the smallest of all seeds. Technically, it is not the smallest of all seeds. But the thing about the mustard is that that was its reputation. When people thought about small things, they thought about mustard seed. And now that it's in the New Testament, in the Gospels, that reputation has continued on, at least through Western civilization, and perhaps even beyond that. So I think my note said something like the cypress tree seed is technically smaller. But that's not the point. The point is little things become unexpectedly big. And so it is with the kingdom. It starts very small and gradually grows into something great. And also this bit about the trees, the birds of the air. It becomes not something towering and intimidating, but something great, but at the same time homely. So you think about like a great mansion. You take tours of some of those enormous mansions on the eastern seaboard, and you think, this is fantastic, but who could ever feel at home in a place like this, Where's the little corner where there's this old beat-up lounge chair and television and all your comfortable things? So the kingdom of heaven is something that's great and enormous, but at the same time is still homely and has a sense of belonging and nurturing. The birds love to come get it. And I read a description about someone who had seen one of these native trees and experienced just this, that the birds really like the little mustard seeds. They're tasty or whatever. And so there's a lot of birds there in that tree. He said it grew to about 12 feet tall overall. So not a huge thing, but still in that arid climate, that's a fairly large tree for that area. So the first one, it starts small, grows big, and is homely. And then the leaven and the loaf. And if you do cooking, you're aware of this, how it doesn't take a whole lot of leaven to transform a whole loaf. And also, it's almost kind of mesmerizing in the sense of, okay, I've just got this tiny little bit of leaven. Is it going to get into all of this, various parts of this bread? Okay, I know I need it. And as I understand it, maybe I'm wrong here, but the kneading process is really just to kind of speed things up. It's not actually necessary. I think you can just kind of put it in there as you're stirring it up, and the leaven will transform the whole loaf, whether you do anything to it or not.
Are you talking yeast? Is that leaven?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now it's interesting, throughout the Bible, leaven is a symbol of corruption. I think this is the only positive mention of leaven that we get, as far as I recall. So remember, Jesus said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. So leaven gets in there, and if you're not careful and looking out for it, it's going to change everything. So, it's kind of one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. Here's the only positive reference to leaven, I think, in the New Testament. And here it's about the kingdom. And it kind of parallels that mustard seed idea, that a little bit turns into a big thing. But here, it's about transformation, that the little bit of the leaven of the kingdom transforms society. When it gets mixed in, it starts to change things. And then we really shift gears when we get into the next part. First, the treasure hidden in a field. And of course, it's a great find, and so the guy who finds it doesn't want anybody to know about it because he wants to get a good deal and go buy that field and take possession of the treasure. So imagine if your cousin was telling you about how they cashed in their life savings and sold their home, and they bought this plot of land in Kentucky, and they put every single penny that they had into it. And you're like, but what about your retirement? What are you going to live on? How is this a good idea? And then they tell you, well, the land is actually, there's this building on it. It's called Fort Knox. And then you think, well, what a deal. Okay, now I understand what you're getting at here. And it's kind of the same thing with the next one, the pearl of great price. Same point. The merchant finds an extraordinary pearl of value, and he goes and risks everything just to possess that one. So the kingdom is very valuable. It's a precious thing. It's something worth your entire investment. It's not just something that, it might work out, you might pick it up along the way. No, it's something that it's like your whole life can drive toward this one thing. And then we shift gears a bit again when we get to verse 47. And it's kind of like back to the wheat and the tares that we skipped over the explanation of. The net thrown into the sea, the gathered fish of every kind. And so like the angels, as the reapers gathering in the wheat and the tares, and they're the ones that separate the two, so it is with the same here. The fishermen, when they are emptying the net, they sort the good and the bad, and they throw away the bad and keep the good. So it will be at the close of the age or on Judgment Day. So there's a lot of different things in these parables to pull out, and I'm not sure how you pull them all together into one common thread, or even that may not be worth doing anyway, because that would be sort of forcing a square peg into a round hole.
Flo, do you remember when you were in junior high that girls had little round balls, a necklace with a mustard seed in it as well?
Yeah,
Yeah, about junior high?
Yeah.
50s?
I've still got one for my granddaughter.
Do you?
Yeah.
And was that a religious thing, or is that
No,
okay?
it's
Well, it
No?
was supposed to be.
well, I didn't know that.
Whether
I just thought it was to be cute.
Yeah.
See.
Interesting.
But it was supposed to be, everybody heard of grain of mustard seed in vacation Bible school, so
Mhm.
they got that stuff.
It's a little glass crystal
Yeah.
ball, yeah.
Well, it's plastic. In San Antonio, it's plastic.
The
Uh,
mustard seeds, the smallest of all seeds, and then it grows up to be the tangiest of condiments.
Well, I just harvested some poppy seeds, and boy, are they a pain in the butt. They got a little bitty hole when you pick the flower,
Uh-huh.
you dry it out, and if you're not careful, I knocked it down and it's scattered all over.
Never heard of you.
So you, when you leave.
Do you plant the poppies?
Yeah.
Have fun.
Thanks.
Interesting. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you.
I'd say just carry